Welcome to Earth, a love story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. This week we welcome onto the podcast my dear friend and sometimes journey guide through the underworld, Samantha Brooks. Samantha is, among many other things, a tarot reader who loves curating readings around people's longing, curiosity, and need for perspective when it comes to spiritual practice, as well as around relationships with non-human beings and spirits. Samantha is wise, funny, earthy, and kind, some of my favorite qualities in a human being. Our conversation spans joy, grief, the underworld, and the necessity of futility. To find out more about Samantha's offerings, check the show notes. And now, please enjoy this conversation between me and my dear friend, Samantha Brooks. We've known each other for what, a year, maybe? Yeah, ish?
Yes,
Yeah.
ish, I think so.
Yeah.
Well, a year in COVID times, I think is a good 5-year stint of friendship, I'd say. It's like the level, even though, we've talked maybe 3 or 4 times still. I think it's just.
Yeah. It's, how to say it, but like Zoom friendships or whatever this is, only through the medium of technology are definitely different, because there's a lot that I don't know about you. There's a lot that you don't know about me, but we kind of just picked up immediately. We sort of just picked up and didn't need to know all of the background stuff. We just were able to be friends and connect. And that doesn't happen, I don't think, when we're like flesh and flesh. I don't know what most of your house looks like. I don't know what your children look like. So the things I know about you are sort of ethereal.
Yes.
Like I know that you are skilled in the underworld, and I know that you're very earth-based and connected to nature and to the spirits here, and intuitive and kind, and like I know all of those things about you, but I don't have any context for how you became that. It's interesting.
That is. Thank you. That's very nice to hear. And I can say the last couple of years, the friendships that I've made, strictly online, I mean, they're precious in their, I guess, how do I put it? The fragility of it in a way, because what if we discovered all the things about each other, which we maybe never will, but there's something to be said for that. Is when you were talking, I was thinking about how when I do tarot readings, a thing I've learned, which it took me many, many times, is that I read best when there's a screen in between us people.
Oh, wow.
Because it's too much for me. So I'm trying not to say energy anymore, because I'm a hipster and I have to use the latest word or the oldest or something I come up with. But I guess current that I'll use. But the current that I connect to of that person and all the things that are between us, when I apply that to the friendships I've made, these are really special friendships on a whole different level. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. And I don't know why that is exactly. I remember the first either kind of coach sessions or therapeutic things that I received on Zoom. I really did not think it would work. I was like, how can this work when I can't feel you and I can't see all of the things, and our bodies, nervous systems aren't interacting and all of those things aren't happening? And it just worked. There's real connection that happens there. So why not? I love that.
Mm-hmm. I feel deep love for you, and I don't really know you, but this has allowed that feeling for me,
Yeah,
so
me too.
it can't be all doom and gloom without bypassing the fact that it is a current that it does affect bodies. But I don't know, I just worry so much about sounding like I'm just, kind of in my privilege, just saying, oh, it'll all be fine, it'll work out. No, people hundreds, thousands of years ago learned how to protect themselves as best they could from the invisible forces, or did what they needed to do. So will that kind of slowly follow. We'll just find these ways of,
Yeah. We just don't have memory as a species. We're so amnesic, we just don't have this long memory of who we are. And so we can look at this kind of snapshot in time and we can see a little bit back into the past and we might be able to see a little bit into the future. But when I look at this time and how quickly things have changed and how everybody's connected all the time around the world, it makes me think of this part of our evolution or even part of our remembering is that we can ride those currents and that we can know ourselves in a way that we couldn't before that happened, and that it's happening really quickly and we're not adjusting great. Like I always feel like, again, in my little small window view that I have, I always feel like humanity is like scrambling to catch up to the thing. It's like we're scrambling to catch up to the fact that we have that, like, AI is burgeoning and we create these things that get out of our control really quickly and then we try really hard to catch up to it. I don't know, it feels sort of like mind training for other senses and abilities that we have.
yes.
Being able to connect like this and being able to, for our minds and our hearts to connect across these vast distances does feel like some sort of training thing. It's some sort of
Mm-hmm.
like, what do we feel like to each other, even across vast distances? And how can we connect? Because I have people that I'm very close to that we don't need to pick up the phone. We don't need to, it's that connection is absolutely there and it's consciously there. And then the picking up the phone and leaving a message or connecting that way just serves as confirmation because we both go, oh yeah, 5 minutes ago, that's, yes, absolutely, we had that connection, and it's that confirmation and validation. Could we do that without these currents that exist, without like tapping into this technology that feels very advanced on one hand, but also
Mm-hmm.
very clunky on the other hand, compared to the instant connection that can happen between minds and hearts? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know.
Exactly. There's, yeah, so much there that you said. I know for me, when again, I just reference tarot because it's, my kind of my world, which I have, like, seems like I have these two different worlds. But knowing that when I'm in a reading with somebody and we're talking together and we're looking at these symbols, that I know that part of what we're doing together is remembering in
Mm.
some way of things that we once knew, or that there is that knowing. Because, yes, like, we're just in this, did you say snapshot? But this snapshot of time where our
Mm.
memories don't go too far back or forward. It's back to, like, I just refer to nature too, and how these things should be simple. And it is like we're clunky trying to learn. Whoever, whatever, is looking at us putting on headphones and, like, using these weird things to connect to like, because I think they are, I mean, these currents, these beings, they've been here since the beginning of time. So, oh yeah, there's those humans. What are they doing? Why do they all those things to tap into something that is just there, and always has been
Mm.
there? When I hear you say, or when you said that you have this connection with a person and that you can feel them, and then later that phone call or that message is like a confirmation. But part of me, and I think that's like, is that human piece of, like, that scares me in a way, because it is that dichotomy of, like,
Mm.
the grief around that, to know that ultimately, in a way, we're alone physically, but just to know that somebody's thinking of you and having that connection, but that just seems so lonely too. So maybe it's this constant scrambling for connection as much as we can get. Maybe we're just trying to remember too, that scrambling is just really trying to just go back or forward or whatever, if time is just this weird thing too. I just think of my own life too in the last couple of years, and how much the privilege I've had to really dive into who I am and what I need and want. And a lot of it was scrambling and trying to, like, figure it out and do all these things and try to be like that person or those people, and then slowly realizing that a lot of it is my own way, and this is for everybody.
Mhm.
And it is this kind of rewilding or like simplicity and just focusing on my what is in front of me and what I have. And maybe that's what we're doing too.
For me, that translates to this turning in or being brought to the precipice where there's like, for me, that's what it felt like. There's no other option. There's nothing external anymore that I can cling on to help me feel safe or to help me make sense of the world or anything. And so eventually the only option, because my nervous system was fried and my relationships were falling apart and I was so burned out at my job that I just couldn't do it. And I literally couldn't do it anymore. It was terrifying to start to let go of, or start to not even let go, but be clinging on with my hands and fingernails, and they're just like pulling out of my hands, and I don't have anything else to hold on to. And then the thing that I found in that was my own internal, what I call the sacred interior. And it's an entire universe, it's an entire world that's inside of us. And it's weird that it's just kind of come online.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's culturally, I don't know if it's like this, the machine of culture just doesn't give us space and time to do that, and also doesn't value it at all. This, it's all this, materialist realism, and there's no place for the beauty of our sacred interior worlds and the importance of them and the value of them. I think that we should take ourselves seriously. And then I think at some point there'll be like this flip to that where it's like we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously. But I think because there's such a dearth of that in the world right now,
Mm-hmm.
that it's what we're being called to do, like go in, take ourselves seriously. Who are we? Because what I've seen over and over, if we do that, is then there's some alchemy that happens and then we become useful to the collective again. Like first we go in, we hear, we recover, we listen, we heal, we find all of this wisdom and depth, we mature. And then at some point that enough safety and goodness and love builds up. And then we want to share it. Then we want to be like,
Mm-hmm.
now I want to help other people do this. And so it's ultimately like, first, it feels really kind of selfish and navel gazing, I guess. Or maybe that's, just what I think I'm supposed to say. But it actually felt very delicious to go in and start taking it seriously. And I know
Mm-hmm.
that, like, from the little that I do know about you, I've seen you do the same thing and go into those depths and then return with not only the knowledge of how to go down and in, and somewhat of a map of that landscape, even if it's not a linear, this to this to this, but you have enough of a view of that place down there that now you can walk next to people on their journey and help them take the same journey. And when we first started talking and when we first met, there were those pieces of you that were definitely fully capable of that, but it's come into a fullness that feels different to me.
And when you were talking about the people going inside and kind of looking at themselves, and that, you were talking about or I felt connected to, that's like how, that's my goal with tarot for people. That's the only way to be of service, I guess, is to service of self first. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know where this be of service came from. And when you were saying how like you just couldn't do it anymore, your nervous system couldn't do it anymore, and that kind of grabbing on to that cliff edge, that precipice, that's the fool. And this is like
Mm-hmm.
my teacher's line is with the fool, it's like this fear of leaving the ground. And but the idea of like, what if there was never any ground to begin with? There's no there, it's just all space. And it's that cry of that, what did you call the inner self?
I call it the sacred interior.
That's wonderful. I don't say higher self, I say deep self. But that's the deep self crying out and saying, I need to move, I need to let go, or I'll die. Like, I can't do this anymore. And that's the call of the Fool. Like, I refer to nature and looking at the seasons and the cycles and how the beings are. And it's just this surrender. Like, it's more of surrendering to what is here and what is. And surrender and weakness are not synonymous. They are not the same. Surrender, I
Mm-hmm.
think, is so brave. And I do think like that it's coming back to the simplicity of things, and this that our output determines our worth. If we could just be ourselves and whatever that looks like, and that is not an output thing, that's not like I was meant to be a writer necessarily or anything. It's just I am like that pine tree. I'm here and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I exist. And it's that simple. And then whatever comes out of that comes out of that. But the other thing too is, this is weird, but I like weird. What if, because we've all, like, this humanity has had this huge shift, and I think it does coincide with technology and the rapid advance of technology, is it because we've tapped into these currents? Whatever, like, and that's what I call the tarot. They're just mere symbols of these currents. They're highways, they're whatever. Is it because we've sped up so much? Is because we're actually tapped into these currents now? And that's what's happening. And then, and if you're tapped into these currents, and this is no, like, there's no hierarchy here or anything, like, everybody
Mm-hmm.
is in some way, then it's just a whole different ball game. That makes sense. And then when you said the deliciousness of, can I call it surrendering? We're supposed to feel that fleeting joy of that, like, that is joy. And I think there's a lot of guilt around that, like the joy of the body, the joy of simply just existing and being. And I think that's tied to, like, feminine guilt around that very much. But that, I think that's another program thing, which, if, okay, so in my kind of this value system I have, I don't think there's good and evil, really. I think there's balance. I think there is just what is. I refer to nature too. There's some beings that kill and they eat and they just need food. Like, there's no, I don't know, it's just, it's not this malice or intent. Is that just humanity that has that? What do you think? Like, is there some kind of darker current or something? Like, are you ready for that question?
I love that question. I think this was a less popular opinion when I settled into it a few years ago, but I think it's easier to say now that even like with humans, with other beings, and I can even approach the darkest deeds that we do with this same idea, and the darkest deeds that other beings do. You know, the things that
Mm-hmm.
are truly damaging and
Mm-hmm.
invasive and not okay, like the worst
Yes.
of the worst, feels to me like pain. It doesn't feel like malice. It feels like
Right.
I always go to the worst thing I can think of because that's, part of me is always like trying to defend. If I had to defend this, if I had to defend myself against
Mm-hmm.
somebody saying, well, what about? And even that, it's not okay. Like, of course, it should never, ever, ever fucking happen. And the person who did it should not be allowed to keep doing it, and they should face consequences for doing it. And also, this what the studies have shown in my own personal
Mm-hmm.
experience is
Mm-hmm.
that they experienced that same exact transgression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's this pain that rolls through generations, and it's unhealed trauma that rolls through generations. And is there malice behind it? There certainly can be the energy and the expression of malice in an aggressive, violent act. That person can be expressing malice for sure. Even the dark force that sort of feeds on that, which I completely believe exists.
Mm-hmm.
I completely believe that exists. I believe that
Mm-hmm.
there are opportunistic beings that kind of feed on the energy of fear and pain and things like that. Ultimately, I think that it's also unconsciousness and trauma. And that
Mhm.
that's what, as like trying to become more conscious, trying to become aware of the parts of myself that have done horrible, shitty things, I have an option. I can splinter them off. I can condemn them. I can be disgusted by them. I can hate them. I spent a lot of time in my life doing that. And ultimately, what I came up with was like, I can never hate myself enough to become someone that I love ever. It just does not work that way. So that's an option, is to condemn it all and splinter it off. And there's another option, that the heart and compassion and discernment and awareness can hold all of that. And it doesn't mean that it's okay. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't give me a free pass for shitty behavior. In fact, it's the opposite, because I've found that my own transgressions and shitty behavior not only created pain for the people around me, but for myself as well. So it's all just like, why would I do that to myself? At some point, we're all just one thing. And the best, highest move we have is compassion and love. And with love comes fierceness. Like, we can be really fierce and protective, and we should be, I think, for the victims of our
Mhm.
own unconsciousness and other people's unconsciousness. But ultimately, what is the salve? What is the, like, where's the reduction of suffering happen if we just continue splintering away the wounded, violent, unsavory parts? Like, I did it in my own interior. I did it in my own life, in my own world. It didn't work. Like, that's a great way for me to go into deep, dark addiction, external seeking of validation, sell my soul for a few moments of comfort. That
Mhm.
was the result of trying to hate and split away all those parts. I think it's just not very effective. It just doesn't work.
Works for a time, for as
Hmm.
long, and so for some, it works for a lifetime. Because that's, I'm assuming.
Right.
And thank you for like making me check myself too, because it may have sounded like I'm really trying to just check my privilege a lot,
Mm.
because it's when you brought up, um, like the thinking of the worst thing, it's like, well, yeah, so it might be flippant for me to say there's like no good or evil or just balance. Like that sounds like, can I swear?
Fuck yeah.
Okay. Like I being an asshole. I feel like your fuck yeah just made my asshole sound like, ooh, you made my asshole sound so small. So thank you. Because humor,
Mm.
let me tell you, if there's
Right.
parasites that feed off anger and pain, then give me those humor parasites. Yeah, because I'll feed them if I can get funnier. That's what they give me.
I
Um,
love it.
what's been coming up in tarot lately? Like, there's always these themes that are undercurrents that run through, like usually 3 or 4 readings, which is really interesting. In the beginning, I was always like, okay, am I just not in the beginning? It's like every other day. Am I just saying the same thing all the time? Like all that fear comes up. And then I'm realizing, no, there's a collective current to whatever these people, maybe they're sharing it. I don't know. This current of this idea that like we are still human. Like I'm sure people listening to this be like, yeah, but there's people that I work with that are very into like magical practices and working with different beings, and an agreement with beings that they're like, constantly trying to respect and feed even and whatever. And if there's no, it's just what these people do. But this idea of like there's still us as like separate beings, and then there's all these other beings, who knows. In terms of like the invisible, I do think it's very much like an ecosystem where there's these horrible acts and there are beings that feed off those acts and that's their food, and there's no kind of like kind of political Christian idea of like demons for the simple sake of causing all the world's problems. But then there is that human part of us too, that those splintered parts that, pain feeds pain, our own pain. If we can't, I feel like I'm again talking like the asshole, and this is me musing and
No,
not
no.
trying not to like say I know, like I'm not a therapist. I am nothing, but these are the thoughts I have. But the splintered parts too of like too much to bear to face those parts of ourselves and calling them back in. You said like welcoming them back in where there's no, like, it's not like, oh, you have to change to be, for me to even consider acknowledging that you're part of me. No, it's more like, okay, you are a part of me. If I acknowledge you, then that probably appeases you in some way. If I acknowledge you, then we can have a relationship and I can start to heal whatever or work with that part of me. Usually those parts are children, right? The small parts that have just gotten so distorted and so hungry and so scared and so lonely. And that's another theme in tarot that sometimes comes up. But yeah, and then there's the other parts of just, I don't know, I think parts that aren't even our own, that are ancestral, that have been catered to or passed on for so long. Because maybe, where do those parts go when we die? Do they follow lineage because they can't die? They have to go somewhere. And so do we carry those parts and then they become more and more distorted? And that's where I think about maybe some of even the beings that torment people. And that's what made me think when you were bringing up, the acts that humans do. And then I know some people suffer from attacks or from different entity experiences that are awful. And through tarot, I've seen that maybe sometimes they're just these warped, distorted ancestral ancestors that have become these succubi, deformed parts. But then, like, I want to respect all beings. I'm trying not to be human centric here because there are so many beings, but there's sometimes, yeah, it's like these distorted human beings, I guess, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that comes to my mind as you're talking about that, and first of all, you're not an asshole. And one of the things that this time requires, I think, is to be able to be aware of and to be fully conscious of our privilege.
Yes.
And also, it's another paradox, and also be able to contribute and yeah, on one hand, it's really easy to say there's no good and evil because we're looking from this really high view.
Mm.
If you look from high enough, and like Ram Dass used to say that, if you get high enough, oh, it's all perfect. It's all, it's all the parts are playing together and it's all learning experiences and all that stuff. That's true. And also, it is true that here in our bodies, in the world, on the planet, horrible things happen. We do bad things to each other. Suffering is absolutely real. I always
Yes.
thought that, like in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, the first one is that suffering exists. Like we should just spend like a year on that, just to really let it sink in our bones that that's what we're facing is real, true suffering. So that, yes, for sure, acknowledging that, acknowledging the places where we haven't had to experience what others have experienced because of privilege, and then also acknowledging that there's a way to see these things that allow us to help, or allow me to help myself alleviate suffering. Because if I only stayed in the place where I've done bad things in my life and I'm a piece of shit and I've caused suffering and there's no redemption ever, there's not a system of redemption that either I can tap into for myself, or I can, or someone can help me, like a hand comes down and I can pull up and say, it's the most tender, vulnerable, horrible fucking thing in the world to look at yourself as a perpetrator or a victim and be shattered by that grief. But then once that happens, compassion comes and fills those spaces. And if there wasn't
Yes.
that and we could never get out of the suffering, like both exist, and it's okay that both exist. So all of that to say is that you're not an asshole, but I love your use of the word asshole. So
Thank you. I made it weird and slightly like spicy.
love it. Love it. I love it. So the other thing, talking about ancestors and these kind of forces or constructs that move through lineage, and
Hmm.
are we sometimes being haunted by our own ancestral traumas that haven't resolved? The very simple, like real world, down to earth thing that makes me think of is I took an amazing course from an amazing practitioner, and part of it was just this relatively simple exercise where we kind of look at our own constructs. You know, who am I? How do I act? What are my challenges? What are my gifts? And then look the generation above us. You know, look to my parents. Who are they? What are their constructs? What are their fears? What are their gifts? What are the patterns that play out? And then look at their parents. Who are they? What are their gifts? And then look at, I don't have children, but look at, imagine that I have children, and what would they get from me? And how does it just continue through the generations? And that's very clear that it absolutely does go through generations. And if a child born into that takes on some of those qualities, and but there was a start of this innocence from that child. This child comes in as a blank slate, product of the environment and of genetics and of what was going on in the air in the room with
Hmm.
family and all of those relations, and then sort of becomes a lot of that. That it's not that it's number one, it's transformable. Like we can heal those things backwards and forwards. We can release our ancestors from that pain by doing our own transformational work. And also that, yes, absolutely, like, do they show up as entities around us? Are we repeating those patterns? Are we echoes? I think 110% yes. And I wonder, when you do your readings and you encounter beings like that or ancestors, like, again, with the premise that we're not trying to fix anything, or you can only be in my presence if you're good. Not I don't think I'm going to say that.
Wow, you can
I'm
stop
going to leave
yourself?
my question without going on past it, because I'm sure you can answer that question without me like muddying the waters with whatever else is going on in my brain.
You're not. I'm just really impressed that you can stop yourself from saying something. Oh, I usually go, oh, sorry. Um,
Me
Interesting.
too.
Yeah, it's like, wow, restraint. So when I started doing tarot, which is about 3-ish years ago, which I've always had decks, and then just was this kind of like loving, I don't want to say the idea, but loving what tarot meant to me, which is I felt like these cards were, there was something there that I just felt on a much deeper level. And then reading these books, like I don't know, probably since like 10 or 11. And when I listen to people who say, like, oh, I'm not mocking, this is me, one of my inner children who like really doesn't feel that cool at all. But just hearing somebody say, like, I've been doing it for 20 years and blah, blah, blah. And part of me is like, oh, why? Now I'm going to say, oh, I've been doing it for like 3 years, but it's been with me for a long time. Now, again, like through these readings, when I do tarot with people or when we go on this journey together, I get just as much out of it as they do. I come out changed as they do. People have taught me so much, and I've just learned and integrated and changed so much because of other people's journeys. But what I understand is they're just cards. They're just symbols. Again, like these devices in a weird way, they're tapping into these crazy current beings. So tarot's within all of us. So it's been with me forever. So when I started, like I really dove in, like I really deep dived into courses and then with the intention of finding something that made sense to me where in this book it says that this card represents this and it's very external and it's money, love, or whatever, and that never resonated. But I knew that I'm not just going to make up my own shit. Like there is these foundational currents and I just have to find somebody who speaks of them to me. So I found that person who's Lindsay Mack, Tarot for the Wild Soul podcast. And then I took tons of courses and then started reading with people. And I just look how much it's transformed. I'm just going to go with this tangent and trust that it'll make sense. So I started off light in a way, and then slowly it's morphed into this underworld thing where somehow this is what I came up with myself. But we enter the underworld and we meet different beings along the way. And these beings or these currents, however people see them, show up for the person. They pick them out, they see them. I do not usually, but some of the beings are ancestors. And usually the ancestors have a message for that person, and it's something that they really need to know. And I'm trying to speak lightly of this because when I do these readings, they're never able to record. So now I just tell people we can't record them because the underworld doesn't like, you don't do that. Like we're not really supposed to be here anyway. So it's just not going to work. But I know, like,
That's so
speaking of it,
interesting because can I tell you, the
yes,
video and audio have had zero problems until you started talking about that, and then you just froze and it stopped. And I think I lost like 2 or 3 words, so it wasn't a big deal. I heard most of what you said, but very interesting that as soon as you were talking about it, it was like, nope.
it is a nope. And so part of the Nope, which was a really good horror movie, that if anybody has Nope,
Oh, I
you
haven't
guys
seen
need
it
to see
yet.
it. Yeah, it's so good. It's kind of like what we're talking about. Anyway, I can go on tangents and I can come back. So I have this kind of like just this little reservation of like, I just have to be careful of how much I talk about. Not because I'm going to be struck down or anything. It's because somehow I've been given, and I'm not special, but like I have a key. So I just don't want to get taken away. But yeah, so the ancestors give something, but they also take something from us. And it's not like a bad, like it's an unburdening of sorts. And so whatever question you ask, I think it relates to that, where there's usually some light shined in the underworld upon that one little thing that it's like people realize they've been carrying something that was never theirs and that they carried it for the people that, that some that like who we could talk about. I mean, there's well ancestors, there's ancestors that nobody wants to have anything to do with. This comes from the ancestors that loved that person. And it's just time that everybody's ready to lift this thing. And so by that thing being lifted, we could call it a cloak or a heavy coat of armor, but then everybody's changed. So before and after and all around, it's this great weight being lifted. And I really like what you talked about, just looking at the patterns and the people that came before, and then looking at your children and saying that transformation is possible. Because yes, because it's already been transformed. Like these habits, these ways have been like they move through us. Of course, they then adapt to us. But just to like think about relationship for me, like with my mother's maternal line, and I don't know very maybe great grandmother, but the association like with the body, and the body being something like a cage, and the body not being a sensual thing, not it was like just a thing. And looking how, and just the memories of like my great grandmother visiting her. She must have been really old because I'm not, I'm 25, in a wheelchair. And then my grandmother being wheelchair bound, probably in her like 60s, maybe 50s. And then my mother having a brain aneurysm when I was 18, but just her, watching her relationship with her body, but it had morphed, but this still like, when I say body, I mean, I guess feminine too, of how there wasn't much of a connection. But then I look at me and how my mother, sorry, I'll back up, how my mother recognized that and really instilled us being women as like something powerful. And she used it very intellectually instead of physically. But now I look at that for myself and how much I have changed that, and how much where the I can separate my own voice from the voices of the others that came before me. And then looking at my own children have taken that femininity for one and chose, how do I put it? They are non-binary. So that femininity is something that like an ultimate choice for them, something that they can, I don't even know if that's the right word, but it's something that they know that they have the ultimate choice in, I guess. And to become that and to put it aside for a bit, to let it become its own thing and then put it on again. I don't know. And then my youngest child, who's a girl, and using the feminine force fully in body and mind and just being like a force to be reckoned with, where I just see from weakness this ultimate strength. That again, it's these currents that we've all obviously I'm done some changes in this family for the good.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's so beautiful to that I have chills because that was such a perfectly said and illustrated journey of what we're talking about and what I was talking about. Seeing these things and in previous generations there was of course transformation still happening, but such a big transformation in basically 3 generations from your mother who may, I don't know, but could have been the first woman in that line in recent history to become conscious of it and say, I'm going to do this differently with my daughter and
Mm-hmm.
give you a different, allow that transformation or foster and assist that transformation of that energy, that construct moving through. And then you being able to do the same thing for your children. So in 3 generations, just this massive
Mm-hmm.
transformation. And like you said, part of it is this question now, this like, who is my child and how is my child going to express this? And that it gets to be an inquiry and a curiosity rather than installed systems, and that this is the
Mm-hmm.
only way for the feminine to come through. Like, yeah, incredibly beautiful. And when I say constructs, I don't mean dead things. I don't mean like hard dead things. I just mean the I love how you allow and imbue everything with personhood. And I notice that when you speak. And so when I use the word construct, when I said it, it felt sort of dead to me, but I mean the same thing, these alive
Mm-hmm.
things that are moving through and being relational with us. Yeah, really profound and beautiful. And yeah, just acknowledging too that like who has time to be like sensual in their body when there's just a bunch of shit ton of trauma, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's I think that that's one reason why our generation is able to do a lot of this like healing work and becoming conscious of the shadows and conscious of the places where these patterns were deeply in place for so long, and being able to choose and do something different, or at least approach it and begin to process the grief and all of those things, because we're resourced. We're not
Yes.
in fight or flight survival 24/7. And it's only like that's why everybody needs to be. That's one reason why everybody needs to be in that place, because that's where healing can happen. Like, I don't know how you do it if you're just scrambling for life and to keep your bodies and your children safe and all of that. I think that that's why we've been able to approach it, because we're resourced, you know?
Yes. Like thinking too more about the experience of what it's like to be in the body as a woman too. And, alongside, I just think about without going into too much detail, but there was this kind of, alongside this, like being told, my sister and I, that we were, beautiful and powerful women. There was this kind of like, from my mother too, there's hardly any good men. So get as many as you can. But we all have three different fathers, me, my brother, my sister. And so I lived half at my mother's, half at my father's. But yeah, like I was raised by my mother to never get married, because you don't do that. I think that was a loss of freedom for her in some ways. But then I look at the masculine or men to her was my grandfather, who was an alcoholic for a very long time, but also I feel like there was some abuse there, because my relationship with my grandfather, there was some very inappropriate and very uncomfortable situations with him that I was put in that never really escalated, but it was obvious. And so for me too, as this feminine, finally having the ability to actually be in my body because of some sort of shift ancestrally, was an experience too of like, well, what is this body for? And learning about that through, again, that like the masculine through men in some ways. And then, ending up in a almost 25-year relationship, which would have been blasphemy to my mother. I'm sure she would have loved it, but just kind of like, what? So, along like this dichotomy again of, can I honor the joy and honor the like, what a gift I was given from my mother in that respect of the joy of being in the body, and understanding that as a woman, like I'm not supposed to be quiet, or I can dance. There's a lot of people who don't dance unless they're drunk, or no shame, no like shade, nothing, but I was given that. But also the grief of then not knowing the boundaries and the limits that this body was supposed to have, because that was never taught to me. That's something just recently starting to like learn, that this body is also mine and has a right. I have a right to it, and I have a right to be here in this body. So having the ability to have the joy and the grief of that, because those two emotions, while separate in a way, they're very much connected. Grief and
Right.
joy, one can't have one without the other, I would say. They flow into each other. And something you said too earlier about Ram Dass, and talking about how zooming out and seeing everything, as perfect in a way, as like things working like they should. I know in my Canadian grade 5 education of the pond study of the ecosystem, right? Being able to look at it as a functioning, healthy system. But when we're in it, I think this is like this kind of theme of integration and learning about being able to live in two feelings at once, two emotions at once, the pain and the reality of this world, but the gift of being in these bodies in this world. Because I have a little bit of education in developmental psychology and attachment theory, because that's my part-time job, is working with families of young children and talking about these things. But I just think about development and how children's prefrontal cortex is kind of the last thing to develop. But the idea around the prefrontal cortex and its development, and how around, like, let's say between the ages of 5 and 7, that the idea of like the ability for children to be able to mix feelings. So to have one thought or emotion or two, and to hold them in this, like this or like my brother hit me, and instead of like just like he hit me, all I can feel is anger. The brain then starts
Mm-hmm.
to go, oh, he hit me, but I love him. So what I'm trying to say is, I think on a deeper level, like our brains shifting, that we're able to have this integration more of this, and hopefully this is what we're moving towards. So we have the ability to act is being always between grief and joy and being able to still live between that instead of being either frozen by it or fighting against it and only being able to focus on one or the other. So disassociation, right? Or bypassing or just the ultimate grief, which, I mean, depression is real, anxiety is real, all these things are very real. I'm talking about this kind of undercurrent of maybe what is happening, the ability to just face the things, I guess, and maybe integrate those parts that we talked about earlier too, and not shutting them out anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that is where I live, the both and of grief and joy. I was given sort of a directive and part of my mission and, from the ETs at some point, and they told me, basically they were talking about moving from a paradigm of evolution through suffering to a paradigm of evolution through joy and creativity, joy and creativity. So I was given that message a long time ago, and I had no idea what it meant or how, like, it had not moved through my body in any way at all. I mean, I kind of got it intellectually, but it was only after going through all these wheels of suffering and getting really good at going down into the underworld and dying and then coming to life again, and the transformation happened, and starting to trust that experience rather than being like, you know the claws on the edge of the cliff. I started to be able to go into it more easily because I began to see that it was this regenerative transformational process. And so when I got really, really comfortable down there, all of a sudden the directive came in that was like, okay, you've got that, you understand that as well as I can through my own experience and intellectually and
Mm-hmm.
also like somatically body. Like, I'm familiar with that territory and landscape. And then they said, now joy. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking? Like, how? I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how to do joy. I don't know what that means to have joy. I don't know how to move from evolution through suffering to more proactively evolution through joy. And so I started to feel into it and explore it. And what I found was that joy and grief were right next to each other. They're just like they're closer to each other than, for me, than joy and love. They're closer to each other
Mm-hmm.
than, it's like they're they're almost two sides of the same coin. And I was so surprised by that. I was very shocked by that because it doesn't make sense to me intellectually. It doesn't seem that they should be that close together, but they are absolutely that. And so slowly over the past couple years, what's been happening is that I've been able to experience what you're talking about, which is this both and. I can live here in, like, I'm not separated from my grief. I'm not going to reject it. I'm not going to push it away, push it down, say that it's not as bad as it feels. Like, I will visit my grief. I can sit with my grief. And also, I can connect with joy. And the joy, like, as difficult as it was to approach my own suffering and grief and agony, joy is like even more tender and vulnerable to approach. Once you get down, like down, down, connected to all the grief and pain and being able to see that part and having compassion for those things, then the hope of joy feels so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what I'm moving into and growing into. And joy and creativity, I think, do go together. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the underworld darkness, grief and pain and creativity go together as well, but it's different. It's a different
Mm-hmm.
sort of experience. So yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And it's one of those places that I'm learning through my body. I'm learning it somatically. My mind isn't fully wrapped around it. Like my intellect isn't fully, I don't really understand why joy and grief are right next to each other. But in the same way that boundary and compassion are so deeply linked.
Right.
As like you were talking about, like this body is mine. I get to be in this body. I get to experience it sensually, exploring because I was completely boundaryless as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I,
Mm-hmm.
from beings, from unsafe relationships, from family relations, like all of it, just did not have a boundary. And learning about what boundary is and learning that my compassion and allowing without boundary is really, really dangerous and not as it's not it doesn't have a strong enough container to hold a compassion. Like eventually I just was shattered anyway. I couldn't hold the compassion because there was nothing, because there was no boundary. So again, I get that somatically. I don't get it fully intellectually, but I'm feeling into those things. And I love when I come across people who know what the fuck I'm talking about when I talk about joy and grief, because it's like, oh yeah, you've been there. Like you've been down
Yes.
and you've gone down. You've seen it. You're something different now. The there's a forging and a tempering that happens when we bear our own agony, when we
Mm-hmm.
can fully, or at whatever level we can, experience it, and we die, and then we don't die and we come back. We die, but part of us does die. Part of it becomes compost. It becomes like this so that something new can come out and
Yes.
regenerate, and you can feel that in another person. That's why I'm like, everybody that I can feel who hasn't done that yet, I just want
Mm-hmm.
to, like, I turn into this, not like dark, not nice. I'm just like, come with me, like come
Yes.
down here with me.
Come
They're
on.
like, fuck off,
Come on,
no.
man. Come on.
Leave
Have
me
you
alone. I'm
ever?
just like watching football. Give me a fucking break. I don't want to go down in the underworld.
Yeah,
Fair.
exactly. But come on. Come on. I just want to make like a food analogy. Like, you have not had pickled ginger inside like a rice bowl with, I don't know, capers. I don't know. Come on. I know it
Right.
sounds
Just try
scary
it.
and gross. You might not like it at first, but it's actually really good. And I love your door. That could be the door to the underworld right there. That's so
I know,
beautiful.
right?
It's beautiful.
Thank you. I am so lucky that I got to build this house with my dad,
Yeah.
because I always wanted to either have a house built by him or have him help me build my own house. And it's not how I imagined it happening after the death of my beautiful relationship and
Mm-hmm.
uh, everything changing in my life. But I get to be in a space where we like built that door together. It's really nice.
I can guarantee that it's never the like the dark thing, the good thing is never how we pictured it going. And it's always
Right.
something that we never thought we could have too. I don't know. That's why I like this idea of like underworld and shadow work and like this my own kind of thing. It's like, oh no, because I'm really good at being vulnerable if I'm in charge of my vulnerability. Oh yeah, I face I know all my shadow work that I have to do. It's this and this and this. And then it's like,
Right.
oh, well, look at this. Oh no, no, no. And it's like you don't know
Right.
the things that you're hiding, or really, you might have a sense, but you don't really know. Or you have a sense of it in the fact that you say it's not you and you would never do that. There's
Right.
your key.
Because it's necessarily in the darkness. Like that's where it is. We
Hmm.
can't see it. That's
It's the thing
the
that you never
quality of
thought.
the shadow. Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
thing you never thought you could change, would change, or like be. So joy and grief. So that makes me think again back to I'm so thankful for my education and the career that I had. I had it for about 7 years, and then government cuts and all that. And while I was doing it, I always had it like this idea is like it's not fully me and it's not something that I'll do forever. And I'm just doing this and I never felt good enough, blah, 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 all that. But I am so thankful for it and the education I had. And I'm also realizing my work with families and children and my own children, that's where all of my learning comes from and all my true real experiences. And And so when you were talking about the shattering, that's grief and all of it, it just made me think about, again, with young children. And this is what I'm finding too, the more I read tarot, is we have to grow up as people. We have to leave our childhood, our children behind in some state. We're made up of parts of ourselves and we're made up of parts of other beings. We're merely thresholds or containers. There is a sense of us and who we are. That's one point of my readings. Two, I think, is for people finding the essence of who they are. But also, we're like an interface for a lot of things, I think. But there are parts of us that we necessarily leave behind. And I think this journey that we're on is then we get so far away from ourselves to turn around and come back and gather like the keys of who we are. And I think it's all based in childhood, because thinking about kids who, like young children before that typical, I'll say it's less and less that there's a typical developing brain. But let's say textbook developing brain, not even real, but before that, like 5 to 7 age, where their information processing is very much one feeling, one emotion at a time. So young children, and I feel like that's where, like, to be purely a child, that pure innocence, and not pure in a Christian sense, or there's the pureness of feeling that emotion fully, experiencing it. And so with young children, how do they feel emotion, or how do they get to a different emotion? They have to fully feel the first and let it move through them. And when it comes to the big feelings, especially anger, sadness, grief, it's futility. They have to come up against, and that's why we tell children no. It's, besides I love you, it's one of the most important words to tell the child, is so they can hear that. And futility is like coming up against that wall that they know they cannot get over, they can't change. So what do? They surrender. And that is grief. This surrendering to no, to something that you cannot change in that moment. And that's where tears come in. That's where, like, literal physical tears, is that grief, that heart opening, that shattering that allows them and us, and this is that journey that we come back to then find joy. It is like, that's why I wrote down too, it's like grief is very much this internal process. And for me, joy is grief being realized in the outside world. It's hard to, when you said it's hard to intellectualize, because these are, I think we have like very deep base emotions, grief, joy, the big ones that are more felt than, because they're so fleeting, they're so internal, they're so deep in the earth. So joy, it's like then you're open to it. You can have this grief that is like cleansed you in some way, that's made you bigger and fuller. So then it's like you said, I think, then you have this room to go, oh, literally that pine tree, holy shit, that just fills me with joy. And you can't, just like grief, you can't go looking for that shit. We come up against joy and grief, the futility of them, then no, you can't even get over joy unless you surrender to it. You can't move through joy. You cannot feel joy unless you fully surrender to it. Same with grief. But I tell people too in readings, like, it is those emotions that are the keys to finding a door with so much, however, I say magic because I haven't come up with a different word. It's the magic of your own self and your own skills and talents and all of it. But it's in the body, it's in the emotion, and that idea of not being able to intellectualize those deep feelings is because our brains, our nervous systems really just govern our physical existence. Our bodies, it's our radar for safety, right? For being like able to function and however we're able to in this world. And so the brain does not make sense of grief or joy because it is the ultimate threat to staying safe. Mm-hmm. Meaning staying safe as in not changing or growing, because that is a threat into itself, because then part of that ego brain piece will be lost. We could probably talk hours about that. So of course we can't intellectualize. We have to, then it's that integration, that like understanding, I'm feeling a lot of fear around being vulnerable, being sad, or being so joyful. But I know that fear resides in my head, basically, and not in my body. And if I can hold knowing that that fear is actually a signal to like fully just give myself over to these emotions, that's why you can't intellectualize your way into growth and change. It's an aid in a way to be able to talk about it, maybe, but
yeah,
it's all inside.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you. That was like,
You're
when you
welcome.
get new information, and I use this example all the time, so I'm sure I'll repeat myself, but when you get new information and you don't have the neural network for it yet, and so I'm just like, I'm sort of gobsmacked, and also it's not something that's at the tip of my tongue to even talk about because it's new for me. But the thing that really hit was hearing you talk about how it's important to say no, which that's like, talk about a boundary, right? So that's a boundary, like no, and have something that we have to reckon with. And I know that you're talking developmentally, but because I don't have children, and my framework for it, like where my mind goes with it, is that it's important for us to have something that we can't get around, like you said. Like you can throw a fit, you can throw a tantrum, you can kick the wall, you can promise, you can like hold your breath, or like do all the things that kids do and that we do as adults as well when we come up against that thing, and nothing works. The way that you articulated that is my experience with finally being able to approach going down to meet my own pain, because I tried everything else. I tried numbing it. I tried doing a lot of drugs. I tried having a lot of sex. I moved 32 times. Like I just tried everything that I could think of to try to get through it or around it or over it, or for it to go away so I didn't have to look at it anymore, whatever.
Yeah.
And it was only when I had like exhausted every avenue that I finally turned towards it and became willing to, the words, the language for me is like to face my own death. I became willing. It's like, I know this is going to kill me. I know there's no way around this. And surrendering as well. Like, I love that you're bringing that word into it, because surrendering to the grief, which in the last year, as my ex-partner and I were breaking up, and he broke up with me, which of course was just, for my attachment systems and all of my things, was just the most horrible, horrible thing that could have happened. But in a very, it's a very kind, safe, loving relationship. And we both decided that we were going to just stick with it. Like, we're going to break up, but nobody's going to get kicked out tomorrow. We both need time to stabilize. We're both wrecks. So we're going to cohabitate, live in separate bedrooms, get some plans going for ourselves, figure out where we're going to go next. And so it ended up being this 9-month long process of us surrendering to what was going to happen during that time together. We just said, not only surrendered, but just said yes to we knew it would destroy us. We knew we would totally shatter with it. And what it looked like in real flesh and blood world was us on the kitchen floor together, clinging to each other and sobbing our guts out. We attended the funeral of our relationship for 9 months, and it was just fucking horrible. But I think we became grown-ups. I think we became kinder, we became more compassionate, we became better people. We became bigger. Like you were saying, there was this capacity that arose that now each of us is able to hold grief. And because that capacity was created, now there's other things that are coming in and that can be in that space as well. So yeah, the way you articulated that made perfect sense to me. And I'd never thought of it that way. And the idea that you come up against something that you cannot control, you can't change, you can't affect really, that you just have to let it wash over you like a tsunami and surrender and you just die.
Yes.
That not death practice as well? Is that not like practice
Yes.
for the end of our life? And when we come to death, it's the same thing. There's no negotiation there.
Nope.
You can't talk your way out of it. You can't pay your way out of it. You can't beg and
It's like,
plead for mercy. You just die.
mhm.
Yeah, amazing. Wow, thank you for all of that.
Of course, there's more.
Oh, good. Give me it.
Um, well, when you said like you don't have children, so this is about like this, I guess the safest way, I'm sure there's all the other ways, I'm just saying this, the safest way to study our own, the reason why we are, or even from a safe distance to study children and how they behave, I think is just a really safe way for us to do that. This is
Mm,
basically, this is human development. Like the development just doesn't stop at 18, 21, whatever, 28, right?
mm,
This, if this is what aids in development, so that the feelings of futility, being able to have tears, being able to surrender to emotion, being able to move through it, aids in development. And looking again at my education and just in this attachment theory, which attachment just means love. They had to come up with a sciencey word for love.
mm,
And this is Dr. Gordon Neufeld. If he's, yeah, wonderful. But he talked about futility, right, as surrender. But when you were talking about your relationship and the grief of your relationship, I think about how, like I tell parents, it really is simple. Parenting is simple, or should I say, growing a child up is actually simple. All
mm,
you need to do is provide a safe space, provide this kind eyes, like just provide a place where this little person can move through their emotions, can
mm,
be told no and with safety, and can even be told no, and that grows a child up. So we have these systems within us. We have all the tools within us. Now, with parents, when I say like parenting or you're whatever teaching your child, you're not. We're parenting the parent to first
mm,
realize that their child is not an extension of them, then to do their own kind of recognizing, oh, when my child gets sad, why does that make me mad? Oh, I'm just going to go over here and kind of figure out, oh, because sadness wasn't okay, crying wasn't okay in my family, whatever, right?
mm,
Some parents are willing to go there, some are not. But when we're talking about ourselves, we have the tools within us. Some of those tools are probably warped or have been taken away, and that was just the reality of our generational impact and blah 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 all the way back. But surrender can only happen within safety. And so when you were saying your partner, being there and you both grieved, like that grief too, I believe it can only happen within safety. And that's what we need to provide ourselves in some way to recognize when it's safe to do that. And that's, again, like I say this all lightly. And I mean, it's simple, but it's the hardest thing that we'll ever do.
right.
But this is just development. So knowing that surrendering to what's here, that is that futility. And with these tarot readings too, I don't know, there are times for people like all I can do is just provide this safe space And yes, I fight with this. Like, I'm not a psychologist. This isn't psychology. This is our own brains, our own emotions are the vehicle for which we can commune with these currents. So, yes, it's psychology in a way because that's how we interpret is through our psyche, but it's deeper than that. But watching people go through these processes when it's just a card and I just say something or I don't say anything at all, my deep value is to provide safety for people to go, okay, there's something about this. Oh, wow, that really hits hard. I don't think I could ever come up with this myself. And it's like, no, it's because you're actually safe to do this. This is not me doing this. But sometimes at the end of these readings too, it's just like, okay, I try to tell people for one thing, when you said when we were talking that you don't really have words when you hear something, it's because there's deeper stuff happening and I'm not tooting my own horn or anything, but they're changed and the brain has somehow been the nervous system, the ego has somehow been felt safe enough to allow that. So there's no articulation needed. Yep, this is how it is. You don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. We don't know what just happened.
Right.
And I will admit there's insecurity that comes up too because people are like, okay, yeah, well, I just really have to think about this or integrate or whatever. And I'm like, yep, because it's none of my business what people think about the readings or anything. But I know maybe they'll never be able to really even put into words what happened. And again, it's like once they leave, I do check-ins, but it's not my responsibility. But what I'm trying to say is it's simple. A lot of it is really simple, and the gifts that they are given sometimes don't even register and are just so simple. But I trust that in this way of like this surrendering to whatever's happening in the underworld, there's some kind of change that has happened. And maybe people won't even consciously ever be aware of it because what we do does not reflect what has happened, is not necessarily reflected in how people are thinking or feeling because that might not even be true. Even if this is all, whatever we're talking about is not a real thing, whatever that means, I really like to hold on to this feeling that I have that there are like these shifts that happen when people come together and just go through these processes and can never really articulate what it is, but just like you saying that and then trusting in what I know about the human processes to develop are simple and sometimes you just can't even really say what they are. This,
Yeah,
this,
that's really amazing because listening to you describe that process, right? And what happens, and that something happened. There's some sort of, or in my reality, the things that have happened to me in my life, like all this ET contact,
mm-hmm,
and it's almost always accompanied by ontological shock. So, like, reality shifts a little bit. And when reality shifts a little bit, the system is kind of stunned. And if that happens in the container of safety, then to me, because this happens with my clients as well, like, we'll get to a point, sometimes through like guided journeying or hypnosession, or sometimes just through coaching, but there's something that happens that is beyond words and that is beyond logic and beyond intellectualization. Like, maybe we have a framework for it, but there's some intangible alchemical something that happened. And I find it in ET experiences. I find it in traumatic experiences.
mm-hmm,
I find it in the first psychedelic experience I ever had. It happened. Shifting timelines, when I've been able to, when I've felt that temporal like wobble that happens when timelines truly shift. It's the same thing. It's like there's this, I kind of want to say shock, but
mm-hmm,
there's some event and the ontology shifts, and then the system, like this, like our human animal bodies, which include the psychology and the psyche and all of those things, is like sort of stunned. And this deep, deep processing is taking place. And then what seems to happen is this gentle unfoldment that, again, may not even be verbal or intellectual or anything, but something changed and something shifted.
Mhm.
And that's why, and I absolutely see that in your work as well. That's why it's not just, no shade to wanting to know about love, money,
Mm-mm, not at all.
relationships, career, like that's our life. That's the water we swim in. It's nice to
Hmm.
get some perspective on that. But these readings that you do go, something happens. Something happens. That's the potential, is that something happens, and it's a nice ontology shock because it is in the context of safety. So when these things come and like batter us and we don't have any context, or and we don't have someone holding that gaze like you were talking about, like you can hold that loving gaze and just hold that safe
Hmm.
space. Then when that kind of shuddering of ontology
Hmm.
comes, it's okay. It's okay. It's not, it's still, unusual. It feels weird. It's still truly new. There's something truly new there. And so that can still be uncomfortable or confusing, something like that. But it happens in a container of safety, which makes all the
Yeah.
difference, because then it doesn't get shoved away, repressed. Like, as we can approach, like you were saying before, we can only approach these things in safety. And that makes total sense to
Hmm.
me. My ex partner and I could only have done that together because we were safe for each other, even though it
Yes.
was horrible and that we weren't always safe for each other. But we went into the end of our relationship with an agreement that we were going to be as safe for each other as we could. And that's the only way we could have approached that level of grief and surrender and all of the things that happen. So that makes total sense to me. I'm curious, and I'm going to wrap us up because you and I could talk for like 7 more hours and with no
Oh yeah,
problem.
no problem.
But I wanted to, are you still using the word chthonic for your
Hmm. It's funny you
tarot?
say
Because I
that.
love that word.
Yeah, me too. I call them underworld journeys. And yeah, I need to like use that again.
I love
Um,
it because it's such a weird word. Like, the spelling of it is weird. It's not a familiar word. It feels a little mysterious and dark. Like it has a
mhm.
whole vibe to it. And the first time I ever heard that word was when you gave me a reading, and I was like, chthonic. I'm just, now
I
it's in my
know.
lex, like I'm using that. I'm using that word. So I was just curious if you had, as you were saying before, like you abandon things as soon as they become part of the
Yes,
cultural. And I was like, is that how,
yes,
can, I still want to use that word. I like it.
please do. And that is very, it's like if I had some sort of, I don't know, like folklore or something that I kind of follow, like first and foremost, it's always nature based. But the closest for me to that would be fairy lore. And that's where
Mm.
that word for me really popped out. And so chthonic, yes. Like even it's a very much sounds like a primal word of the body. Yeah. And one more thing, but that like ontological shock, I'm just saying maybe it's because we do go to the other worlds and the other
Mm-hmm,
worlds.
mm-hmm.
So there's many other worlds. And that, yeah, it's bringing the body back from that.
Because we're
Yeah.
literally touching other realities, or other realities are literally touching us. And our animal body goes
Mm.
to that journey. And there is this natural kind of, we're wired to pay attention to novelty, deeply pay
Hmm.
attention to novelty. If something really good happens or something really bad happens, we, for survival reasons, like make note of it and take deep stock of what that is and where it was and how we got there.
Yes.
And so I feel like it's a very body processing, like all hands on deck are paying attention to something really closely because something happened, even if it
Hmm.
can't be, maybe it never comes up into the mind to be intellectualized, but there's something that reforms us. So yeah, that makes total sense to me, that we are coming
Well,
back, like it is another reality.
yeah, and why that's the thing. It's like how, again, like trusting that why maybe that's where the good shit is where it doesn't have to even be intellectualized
Right.
anymore, with that being able to communicate with somebody without using all this intellectual gear. Because with these underworld readings, and we go there. And I think with the other readings that I'm thinking about and trying to develop, it's we're going places and we walk together. So it is very that, as the children say.
To learn more about Samantha Brooks and her Underworld tarot journeys, visit hedgereader.com or her Instagram accounts at Samantha Reads Good and at Hedgereader. And to book a session with me where we can explore past lives, meet and communicate with guides, or further journey into your own sacred interior worlds, visit honeyheart.org.